I want to make a big point because it seems to be that there's a lot of people who are confused. So here goes. The Earth is having its own history. Humans are along for the ride. Humans are anthropocentric. They think that the Earth exists for them. The Earth doesn't know this. So people are extremely myopic. 600 million years ago, the climate changed on the Earth such that it is said that it snowed for 100 million years. They call that period Snowball Earth. And if you want to find out about it, just go on the internet, on Google, and go Snowball Earth, and go books, and whatever you want to know about it, right? Snow piled up, 5,000 feet thick. We think around the whole planet. Somebody's going to argue that the equators weren't, but if you got everything but the equators, you know, pretty serious. Okay. Then, the big question was always why this didn't stay that way forever. And the answer, it turned out, was volcanoes. Volcanoes erupted and spewed greenhouse gases through the ice, and over another couple 100 million years, warmed the planet up. We owe our existence to those volcanoes. But I actually have a point. The Earth, if we would look at Earth history, the Earth's history is a history of dramatic geological changes that include sometimes quite dramatic climate changes. And we've been living about 10,000 years in the most friendly period of climate in the history of the Earth. The whole history, for about 10,000 years. Scientists say that some time ago, ancestors of our species lived in a forest in East Africa. That climate change came and it made the area more arid, and it changed the forest into a savanna. And that it was because it became a savanna where trees were a distance apart, that creatures that once inhabited the trees had to come down out of the trees. There's some argument that almost everything that distinguishes human beings happened because of first the climate change and then the adaptation to the savanna. It is said that people left the savanna walking upright and started to go out into the world. But I want to point out something that happened. A long time ago, species diverged. And you have to think for a moment about the human being and how the human being is different from a gorilla. The gorilla evolved in such a way that the gorilla can eat almost anything. If it's green, he'll eat it. He gets to a tree, tear the whole limb off, eat everything on the tree, throw the limb away, go to the next one. You would have thought that that was a perfect survival strategy, being able to eat everything. The ancestors of humans had just the opposite problem. They could eat almost nothing. They had to have very specially perfected food, right? So a human comes along and he sees a fruit at the end of the tree. Unless it's ripe enough, he can't even eat it, right? But he can't eat the rest of the tree, can't eat the bark, can't eat the leaves, just has to eat that one lousy little fruit when it's ripe. This has caused a problem for humans. And that is, humans have spent their time wandering the earth looking for something to eat. They had to. Now I know there are some individuals of us who have done this too, but I'm talking about the big migrations of a long time ago, people who had to go somewhere. When humans learned how to hunt, and that took a long time. Actually, at first they hunted things that weren't alive anymore, but we won't go into that. And then they learn how to hunt. It meant that whatever new place they went to, whatever new river valley they went into or whatever, if they could find animals there, and there were almost always animals there, they could eat something. And then they had to learn what else they could eat. So people went from place to place to place across the planet, learning about new environments, finding out what things they could eat in the new environments. And in some of these places, they went and have been there for a real long time. So in some places, humans have adapted to specific environments and to the things that that environment provided them to eat for a real long time. And then we started to see a period of time that humans almost always focus on, and that is since the last ice age. And since the last ice age, two things, big things happened. One, the period of cold Earth receded. The glaciers receded. The Earth got warmer. But this meant that human populations could grow because they had been pretty small up until then. And as they grew, they filled up the place. And as they filled up the areas, it meant that the next time when there was some kind of want, you couldn't just walk into the next valley anymore because the next valley was probably already occupied by other people. So hemmed-in peoples, we think, were probably the first ones to adopt local plants to agriculture. And they didn't adopt the plants that they wanted to adopt. They adopted the plants that they could adopt. So some plants you can plant, and some plants you can't plant so well. In what we now call the Middle East, in Anatolia, it's highly likely that they found grasses there, and they were planting grasses there that would grow. They could find food. They could grow their own food. It was probably not the food that they would have chosen, but it was the food that chose them. So they grew the plants, wheat, barley, eventually oats, different plants. Okay. The first thing that happened when people adapted agriculture was that the new plants caused them to shrink in size. In the first generations, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, people actually were having less food to eat, and people shrank. They'd be there for some generations before they had enough food to eat that they'd grow again. I always thought it was sort of interesting, too. Have you ever noticed that food plants, staple food plants for the most part, you can't eat them raw. They have to be processed in some form or another. So when you're talking wheat, you can't eat a wheat berry. It has to be ripened, then it has to be threshed, then it has to be ground, and then you have to know what to do with it. You have to know how to make it into something that you can eat. So, the first ones were not adapted to the human body, right? The humans had to do stuff to adapt it to them. This is true of beans. It's essentially true of dried corn. It's true of many, many of the plants that are staple plants, rice and whatever. You have to cook it, or you can't eat it, or you shouldn't eat it. All right. Some places were more successful with this process than other places. But I want to just shine the light for a moment, if I could, on the Americas. The European invasion of the Americas came at one of the nicest periods of weather in all geological history. 500 years of pretty good weather. And so people kind of like forgot, it seems to me, that in the 1,000 years before that, there was an incredible struggle for survival in the Americas, with peoples having to struggle with weather. Just for a moment, you could imagine 1610 and the English arriving and the French and were arriving on the east coast of North America. If they could have seen across the continent, and if they had the eyes to see it, what was there to see? In the Southwest desert, there are the remains of civilizations that struggled to create conditions of agriculture, and evidence that some of them didn't make it. And as you follow down into Mexico, there are more. There are dozens of civilizations that grew, became agricultural, and then faded away. They all faded away because of climate changes at some point or another. As you get into South America, you start to see a very interesting phenomenon. No place on the planet produced as many cultivars as was produced in South America. And interesting places too, in the Andes. Not down by the sea and the low elevations, but in the high elevations. The Andes, where the weather is the most unpredictable. In the Andes, one year it's hot, the next year it's cold. One year it's too wet, the next year it's too dry. This is where agriculture actually flourished at its greatest, really. If we look at it, it flourished hundreds of years before the Europeans got here. They flourished in high elevations. They brought plants from low elevation to high elevation because the name of the game was trying to find a way to practice an agriculture in an often dauntingly shifting environment, an unforgiving environment, really. And they were very successful at it, one has to say. But what made them successful was their not only tolerance, but their acceptance of and looking for plant diversity. Some plants thrive in dry years. Other plants thrive in wet years. Some plants get done early enough so that when the frosts come, you already have a crop. Other plants produce much more food if the season's longer. Some plants thrive on thin soil. Some plants thrive on thick soil. Some plants in the same type of plant. There are varieties that have different characteristics. These characteristics of variety are extremely useful if you live in a world that's not predictable. If you live in a world where environments from year to year change and you depend on the food that comes from these environments. So in a way, the Inca, so-called Inca Empire, was remarkable because the Inca Empire was built around food production. Amazingly, I've often been kind of taken by the fact that modern writers look at the Inca Empire and they can't understand how its economy worked. You know, they got an Adam Smith sort of thinking, and they're looking, you know, it says, where was the bank? You know, this or that, you know. How did they do this, you know? It's actually a pretty good, it's a pretty good question. Anyway, I wanted to point this out, that in the Americas, even those ruined cultures represent a part of the human history of struggling against climate changes that are a challenge to agriculture, and that they didn't all make it. In fact, a surprising number of them didn't survive it. And I wanted to say this too, it's not because they didn't have the skills. The conditions were actually, in some cases, the evidence has it that the conditions were actually hard to imagine. I mean, some of them were trying to build on ground that was still rising. You know? So there's evidence. Sometimes they built things where the water was intended to go downhill, and the whole place shifted such that the water was starting to run the wrong way. And there's plenty of evidence to show that they put up the best possible, I think, in lots of cases, effort to survive. Sometimes they were hit by things that no one could have predicted. It's probable that the classic Maya culture was confronted with an 80-year drought. Hard to believe that a culture that lives in the middle of a rainforest could have hit an 80-year drought, but it's pretty good scientific evidence for it. The world that we live in is of only minimal predictability. We don't really know, actually, what's going to happen next. I think that that was what drove Indian agriculture, although people want to call it horticulture, okay, but it drove that. Because in the North American woodlands, the Indians created the most elaborate edible landscaping that you could imagine. And they did it with an interesting sort of way of thinking about the world. They noticed that certain places, certain plants that produced food thrived better than they thrived in other places. So the Indians encouraged food plants to grow where nature seemed to favor them growing. Subsequently, when the Europeans arrived, and the Europeans are never aware of what they're seeing. I mean, the one thing about Europeans, they get here, they see stuff, they don't know what it is, so they chop it down or whatever. But when they got here, what they found like walnut groves. And you would wonder, now why did all the walnuts grow in one place, Somebody planted them there, that's why. And not only that, but wherever you find a walnut grove, you find an Indian village site, or there was an Indian village site. So where the Indians went, they took the foods they liked, the ones that would grow without their attention, and they tried to transplant them there. And when they found a place that they thrived in, they cultivated that in a way. They did a lot of like edible landscaping. The other thing that they did is that they had a tendency to take plants and to plant plants somewhere just in case somebody might need them someplace. So when they were out hunting, sometimes they would plant corn or beans or something way out in the middle of nowhere, thinking that the next guy coming along in the fall, the corn would be there and he'd eat that. And so it was kind of a futuristic sort of thinking about it. Okay, let me say this about being human. Since people came out of those trees and started walking upright, they've created societies that were dependent on two things. They were dependent on their knowledge of the local environment, and they were dependent on their relationship to plants. Humans have a relationship to plants which is not only ancient, but is at the heart of our survival. If we lose our relationship to plants, we lose our struggle to survive. Now that seems to me to be obvious. That seems to me to be so obvious, you shouldn't even have to tell anybody about it, But it doesn't seem to be like it's working that way. You can't find an indigenous culture that doesn't have a long history of knowledge of the plants in its world. Not only that, but they were very, very good at adopting plants. So when somebody else had a useful plant, if they could bring it over here and use it, they would. So one of the things that was there, which is true of farmers anyway in the world, farmers adopt other farmers' plants. If it'll work, if you can raise rhubarb here, we bring rhubarb here. If cabbages are good, we bring cabbages. When the French landed in the St. Lawrence Valley, the French garden was in the Seneca village long before the first Frenchman. And I think this is true of plants everywhere. People see a nice plant, they bring it home. Now that's true a little bit of animals. But let me say this, plants more. Much more plants. Secondly, North America didn't have many domesticatable animals of the kind that you found in Asia and Africa and Europe, which is actually when it comes to animals, it's sort of it's all kind of connected. So when you looked in the Middle East, for example, there was many domesticated animals, and people lived with their animals. Like they had their house, and the sheep lived in the house sometimes, the goats lived pretty much with them. And basically, it was one of the things that created the conditions that really depopulated North America, because humans exchange disease organisms with domestic animals. So they had been exchanging these disease organisms with chickens and pigs and whatever for a long time. And when they reached the Americas, they had epidemic diseases like whooping cough and chicken pox and smallpox and stuff that had been derived that way from humans and animals. And those just devastated the Indian populations. They devastated the Indian population so badly in places like New England that I think that the record is distorted. New England was a food production area that had been honed, it had been planned, it had been massaged by the Indians for centuries. So subsequently, the first thing that the Europeans who arrived in New England noticed was that there was plenty of food to eat. Europe was suffering periodic famines, big ones and little ones. There was periodic food shortages in Europe, and of course, when they arrived was at a period coinciding with a little ice age, so that would make it even worse in Europe. The Indian thing was a little bit isolated from or insulated from those food shortages. It was partly because the way they managed their affairs was they tried to keep their environment such that it encouraged the growth and proliferation of wild animals and a lot of wild plants. So, in the northeastern woodlands, in the year 1620, I would propose to you that it was virtually impossible to starve if you were an indigenous person who knew their plants. 1 out of every 6 trees was a chestnut tree. every chestnut tree, a couple of bushels of chestnuts, So, and the Indians used to make pudding and bread and stuff out of chestnuts. So actually, there were free sources involved in the woods. There were free sources of food out there. There were lots of free sources of food. Every area, even now, every area has plants that humans can eat. Plants that have never made it into the garden. They're not really, you don't really plant them, but you can go out in the woods and harvest them. And a lot of times people who went out in the woods and harvested them they found they had quite a lot to eat. So when the weather got bad, the things that grow wild in the woods often tend to survive better than the things that are growing in the garden. So even when they had a little ice age, the Indians still had food. And of course the Indians didn't foul up the water, so there was fish. And of course there was all things running around the woods you could eat, catch one, and so on and so forth. So I proposed this to you. The first European migration was driven by food. It was driven by food. People in Europe heard if you came to North America, you didn't starve. And a lot of them thought that would be good. So boom, they came. That was the first thing. And people who live in a specific place become adapted to the place. If you live there for 10,000 years, you become adapted to the food that's available in the place. Other people, if they have animals, it might take them a long time to become physically adapted to the food. But they will if they have long enough, which is what's going to make kind of an interesting thing about culture, when cultures come together. I think the most interesting thing about Europeans bring the cow. And of course the Europeans could not have survived in some environments in Northern Europe without the cow. Impossible, They couldn't eat grass, but a cow could. And of course from the cow they can get milk, they can make cheese, they can do this or do that. For centuries there were cultures in Europe that lived on yogurt, cheese, and milk. Then they get over here and all of a sudden they're saying everybody will have a glass of milk. And of course most of the rest of the world can't drink milk. So, without becoming distressed in some uncomfortable ways. So that's just one example, but I think it's true of different kinds of foods for different kinds of peoples. There are peoples in the Southwest, for example, that I've seen who are capable of munching on chilies, that if I try to munch on those chilies the way they do, I'll harm myself. But they eat those things like carrots. Okay, my point being that if you live somewhere long enough and you're associated with food types long enough, the chances are pretty good that you'll adapt to those and you'll be happy with that, whereas the next guy who comes along might have to be more careful with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I think everybody ought to know about. And I think it's one of the two issues that we need to have clear in our minds. We should be very clear about these two issues. Around 1932, there was a dentist named Price, and eventually he wrote a book called Nutrition and Degenerative Diseases. And he made a kind of a discovery. He couldn't understand. He was on vacation one time, and just for the heck of it, he wanted to look at people's teeth. He was a dentist, and he was examining the teeth of indigenous people. And he made a discovery. They had perfect teeth. So he went into older ones. He found people in their 80s who had perfect teeth. So he got to thinking about that. He was a dentist in a city where he was taking care of wealthy people. And he was wondering, why is it that wealthy people in the United States have bad teeth, and indigenous people living way the heck and gone with no care from the dentist at all have perfect teeth? A good question. So then he went around, and his book is wonderful. It's still in print, by the way, and there's a website on it, and blah, blah, blah. But he went and looked, and he went to New Zealand, and he went to Australia, and he went to look for indigenous people everywhere. And his book's got pictures of them showing their teeth. But as he was doing it, he made other discoveries. One of the discoveries was they not only had good teeth, by and large, they didn't have diabetes. Most of them didn't have heart disease. And this would be the thing. They didn't have access to modern medicine, and they didn't have modern diseases. But if they moved into the city, their relatives, this was especially apparent, he found out right away with Alaska Natives. If they moved into the city, they got this stuff. They started getting the diseases of the cities. Since that time, there have been a number of significant, I say mainstream popular accounts that have been parallel to that one. People could look at that one and say, well, he was kind of a quirky guy, and so what? In 1939, a guy by the name of Walter Kempner had a patient, and she had high blood pressure, and she had all kinds of stuff looking like she was going to have heart disease. And so he put her on a diet. He made her go and eat nothing but rice and beans. And she went away, and he forgot to tell her to come back. So she was gone like for 2 months, and she was following his diet. She was just out there for a couple of months, and then she finally came back, and they checked her out, and her blood pressure had gone way down, and all the symptoms she'd had disappeared. Everything was gone. And so he began thinking, he found a diet that cures high blood pressure. It turns out that the diet will also cure diabetes. It's called the rice diet. And of course you can buy it in the store, it's there, no problem. In 1944, a writer by the name of Polanyi wrote a book called The Great Transformation. It's really one of the great books of the 20th century. What it talks about, the transformation he's talking about, is the transformation from 1790, when 90% of the people lived in small farms in rural areas, to 1900, when 90% of the people lived in suburbs or cities. That was the transformation from rural to urban. And he says, his point is really that it was an economic and social transformation. But he doesn't write about food. If he'd been writing about food, he would have had to say, there was another great transformation. Starting in about 1830, the Industrial Revolution entered the food chain. And it entered the food chain, let me put it this way, nothing that has ever been invented from the Industrial Revolution, from its chemistry to its mechanics, to its grinding, to its processing, to its canning, to its preservation, to whatever, nothing has ever improved the quality of the food. It has made the food have a longer shelf life. It has given the food the possibility to put it in cans, and you can drive it across the country. It has made it so that stuff that used to be left on the floor of the canning factory could be swept up, ground up, and put into a ketchup bottle and sold. It has made it possible for people to make money with stuff that used to be thrown away. This has done. The Industrial Revolution has been good at that. It is also, in a way, when the Industrial Revolution in agriculture has made it possible to grow more food on an acre than you could before. It's also made it possible to grow food that can be mechanically harvested, which previously you couldn't mechanically harvest it because it was soft and tasty, and now that it's hard and tasteless, you can use a machine to get it, and whatever. So there was a transformation, all right. There was a transformation in our food culture, and really, some very, very good chefs I once read writing about this said that the American food culture has been declining since 1830. That was true actually up until quite recently, when America has suddenly discovered food. You know, the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, suddenly it's all over the Food Channel and it's here, there, people are doing stuff with it. So it's mixed. It's true on the one hand that more food is more destructive to people than ever before, but on the other hand, it's also true more people are demanding better quality and all this stuff, and so it's a mixed deal. But for a long time, it was headed in just one direction. In 1992, a writer for the New York, the Times food editor for the New York Times, published an article which I think every Native person should read. It was on the Oodam Indians. It was done by Jane Brody. And she talked about how the Oodam Indians had started to use their traditional foods as a way to address their problem with degenerative diseases, but especially diabetes. They talked about a gentleman in there who offered to abandon all foods except the foods of his ancestors. So he had to go back out in the desert and pick desert foods and so on and so forth. The desert peoples, the people who live in the desert are the most susceptible to diabetes of all population groups in the United States. And the Oodam Indians are the top of the list of people who suffered from degenerative diseases. The individual I'm talking about promptly, within 6 or 8 months, was relieved of needing to use insulin, and he cured himself with his own food. Now, this is consistent with the other material that we have that looks like this kind of issue. We have two people here at this conference, who will be at the conference, who have written materials that support the overall idea. Vanda Shiva, who writes about food and indigenous peoples, especially in India, but her stuff actually has sort of universal application. And then Gary Nabhan, he's really one of the most prescient of our contemporary living authors. He has a wonderful book called Why Some Like It Hot that everybody should also read, I think, because he kind of personalizes his experience talking with people and food. But the evidence has piled and piled and piled up. And I think that the most interesting ones have been coming out in the last year. Earlier in the spring, the New York Times ran a series of 4 articles that talked about how there's a problem of Chinese immigrants who have moved to the Bronx from China, who are now suffering rapidly from diabetes. These particular Chinese people don't get fat. It isn't that they blow up and get fat. And the first generation, the ones who actually grew up in China, don't get diabetes. It's their children. Their children grow up on the streets of the Bronx drinking all the pop and whatever, and they're getting diabetes at a very, very alarming rate. It seemed to me, though, that the article is wonderful because it does something most newspapers don't have the courage to do. It talks about why the American medical system won't respond to the reality. the American, there's a thing like, you might call it the medical industrial complex, right? Its purpose is essentially that there's a lot of money in curing people from their symptoms. Like, you make a lot more money sawing somebody's foot off than you do teaching them how to keep their foot. And you make a lot more money doing things like dialysis machines and blah, blah, blah. So there's a whole complex of things out there. And what if the solution to the problem was kind of simple? What if the solution to the problem was, hey, we can give you a diet, and this will lower your blood sugar, and maybe even reverse your diabetes, and keep you alive without drugs, or surgery, or any of those interventions? What if that was the case? Now, how many doctors do you think would come rushing forward to you with a planned thing that your problem is you need to eat more beans? You know, and how many insurance companies would reward the doctor who did that? In this one article in the New York Times, they actually explained that. I thought that was wonderful. That the New York Times, which I always thought was a sop for the big companies and all that, actually explained that the problem was that you can't get the medical community to save people's lives unless they can make money. And they're not going to make any money telling you to eat oatmeal, which actually, on some level, would save your life. So, it goes on and on, I want to say. A book that came out last year called The China Study was, for me, maybe the most single persuasive book. And here's a book which the Chinese government cooperated in. And they went to 86 counties in northern China over, 20 years. And they tracked the health and diets of people in these counties. There was one county where, at the time the book was published, there has never been a documented case of death from coronary heart disease in this county. The Chinese diet is mostly grains, vegetables, not very much meat, not very much fat. The Chinese people who lived in those 86 counties are poor, so they don't get the diseases of affluence. The diseases of affluence come when you buy packaged foods, when you buy, if you look at a grocery store, there's the outside ring, right? There's the fresh vegetables and fruits and blah, 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 and then you might end up over with the meats and this and that, and then the dairy on the outside, the outside ring. Once you go to the inside of the outside ring, most everything you get there is filled with things that aren't good for you. Top of the list, most difficult thing to avoid is sodium. Try to find something that has been touched by corporate hands that doesn't have sodium in it. Why most of the stuff that's been touched by corporate hands is loaded with sodium. Sodium makes for high blood pressure, right? And leads you down the primrose path to death and destruction. So here's a book that the China study, and they're looking at populations. It seems to me that the overwhelming evidence is that people get the diseases their culture lays out for them. So the Chinese, what do the Chinese die from? The Chinese die from pathogens. They get sick. Sometimes they're attacked by parasites. Sometimes they're attacked by disease organisms, blah, blah, blah. You see, something has to kill them, whereas in the civilized world, we kill ourselves. It's a fairly clear, it seems to me, it's a fairly clear thing, except, of course, we don't kill ourselves on purpose, because we're inundated with a cultural message that comes across to us that what is available for us to eat through the commercial food delivery services is good for us. And of course, not being people who question authority very clearly, most people just kind of go along with it. Which gets me to the next two things. The story of degenerative diseases in Indian country has reached epidemic proportions. We're talking something now where the percentage of people dying early has to be approaching the percentage of people who were dying early during the smallpox epidemics. I mean, it's to the point now where almost every time the phone rings from the reservation, you're invited to a funeral. And most of the time, the funeral is of a person under 60. And many times, the person who you're burying isn't a whole person. They've had their foot cut off, or they've died in dialysis, or they've died in one thing or another. This last spring, I buried a cousin who was 29, a woman. This is not acceptable. This is simply not acceptable. Not only that, it's avoidable. But there's two issues here. There's the snowball, and then there's the epidemic. And these two issues need to be addressed. We can't just address one or the other. It seems to me that if there's anything that's predictable, it's climate change. The climate will change. Anybody who doesn't think the climate will change just hasn't been paying attention to what's been happening in the big picture. If you look at the picture over centuries, it has always changed, going to change this time. I was talking with some friends about this. The amount of naivety, even among people who are in the agricultural business, is astonishing. Plants are raised, they're genetically designed for an environment which does not take into consideration the possibility of huge variations. Huge variations. When you have a field of a plant in which every single plant member of the whole field has identical DNA, the whole field, it'll all get ripe on the same day. If anything goes wrong and we don't make it to that day, you lose the whole field. On top of that, the seeds that are available to people, increasingly, we're dependent on huge corporations for the seeds. If anything goes wrong with the corporations, like they have some bad luck and their stock things sinks and something bad happens to them, the kind of thing that you could imagine might happen in the middle of some sort of serious climate disruptions, we'd be left without seeds. I was talking to a friend, and first of all, I'm afraid one of my character deficits is that I weather people who are naive poorly. This person was telling me that we are in a clash of civilizations, and that what's a threat to us, these terrorists are going to come, they're going to blow us up, they're going to wreck the whole civilization, and we have to do something. No terrorists ever wrecked a civilization. Volcanoes have done it. Tsunamis have done it. Weather, bad weather lasting a long time has done it. Civilizations collapse because of stuff that people can't do anything about. That's what happens to civilizations. And what we're living in, eventually, someday, something's going to happen. And then what? The question is, when the peoples came to the North America and they found all these Indians, what they found that Indians had was a vast complex of food plants that they grew, sometimes with attention and sometimes not. Sometimes they knew how to grow it, make it grow on its own. And sometimes they brought it into their gardens to make it grow. But the biological diversity of the Indian food production was absolutely astonishing. Now let me say this. The biological diversity of food production in Eastern Europe was almost equally amazing. Bulgaria, all of the Balkans, all that place. Those areas are full of food products that are, and look at, if you would look at the two sides, into Eastern Europe and into North America, and the native North America, they shared something. The Russians and the people in the Ukraine, they could not count on the weather either. And so they have cold weather food plants and a cold weather food culture over there that could survive quite a lot of misfortune if they keep it, if they always have it. But to do that, you need people who are a community of people who share seeds and knowledge and who actually garden. If the people of a culture stop gardening and they depend on the grocery store, depend on these big corporations for their seeds and everything, they really put their future at risk. They really put it at risk. Remember what I said when I started this? I said a culture has existed since the beginning of actual time, meaning when we actually count ourselves as humans, as a thing that's related to the plants. And we're at the point now where we're kind of drifting to a moment when vast numbers of us don't have that connection anymore. We're not connected anymore like we were to the plants. This isn't a good thing. The other thing, I have young people, the college young people, native people, non-native, whatever, they come to me and they say, wow, what can we do about the revolution? I said, don't get a gun, get a hoe. As a matter of fact, it would be a revolution, would it not? For people to become self-sufficient again. It would be a revolution for people to pay attention to their health issues on their own, to the extent that they can. I know somebody's going to come along, get hit by a car, and need to go to the hospital. I'm fine with that. But I don't think that they've done everything that they could do to see to all the health issues that they need to pay attention to. And I think one way that they can do that is that they can re-strengthen community-based agriculture. Community-based agriculture. And this is an interesting thing. I know it's starting to happen in some of the Indian communities around the country. We've been talking about it for ages, but now there's more people who are saying, okay, all right, I'll do some of it. And it's starting to happen. It needs to become mainstream in Indian country. It needs to be so that the tribal councils say, okay, that's what we do. It needs to be so that the traditional societies say, yes, we do that. It needs to be that young people come out of high school who say, I have a garden. It needs to be that way. It doesn't need to be coerced. It doesn't need to be organized. It needs to be a cultural phenomenon, like it used to be, like it was. So, I'm saying two things here. One is that one of the things we need to do, we need to educate our people to the need and the good positive things that come from us having our own control over our own agriculture, but that agricultural control is connected to our health, it's connected to our future, it's connected to the world we live in. It isn't just raising carrots. It's taking care of the earth and the people. And I think the other thing, it's going to be a kind of a learning process. Those of us who grew up with people who grew up growing things know something that people who didn't grow up with them don't know. Elders possess knowledge. When you raise gardens for 60 years, and then you grew up with people who raised them for 60 years, and you do this, you know what to do when things happen. And that takes a little bit of time, so we want to share. We want a way for people to share that information. We don't want people isolated somewhere just trying to do this. We want them to have a way of connecting with other people. So we need a kind of society that says, okay, now we can find people who can talk to you about that. Things are showing up that we've never seen before. And so I'm going to end on this note. One day, some years ago, about 20-some years ago, my father, who was really quite a observant person, he got a hold of me one day and he says, come outside, I want to show you something. So we went outside. We lived in the woods. Where we were, there was forest all around us. And he walked me over to a little tree about 6 feet tall. And he pointed to that tree and he said, what kind of tree is that? I says, well, I don't know all the trees, He says, you wouldn't know this one. He says, because this tree never lived here before. And he said, and there's bugs here that never lived here before. And there's birds. He says, since I was born, these things have never been here, and now they're here. He says, we're in for something. He says, it's the little things. It's the little things, not the big ones, that will prefer, that come first. We'll see them first, a new kind of bee, another kind of bug, something we never saw before. It means that the world is changing, and it's going to change in ways that we can't predict and that we can't control. But we just really can't sit around with our hands in our pockets waiting for it to happen. We have to be watching. We have to be part of it. I think in the old days, what made horticulture, and that horticulture is where all our food comes from, what made that so powerful, why we have the food products that we have now, is that there were people who paid very close attention to what was happening with plants. They knew what was going on. And people who live out of their garden, they pay very close attention. You might almost say they have a spiritual relationship with the plant. It's very, very powerful deal. And it's something that we not only need to preserve, but we need to revitalize it. We need to give it energy. And we need to make it mainstream again. So here, this was my kind of message for everybody. This is pretty serious stuff. And I'm hoping that our conference, I know it will take us in the direction where we can find out just exactly how can I best use my energies to advance that process. And then at the same time, how can we as a community start finding our neighbors and recruiting our neighbors into that process? We're trying to do this. This is the kind of thing that people do when they're trying to do something positive and good. You don't get anything for it, except the satisfaction of knowing you did the right thing, right? But you won't make any money from it, so you don't need to go to medical school. You can do it from wherever you are and whoever you are, and you can do it pretty much all the time. Okay, this is I've run out of time. Okay, so this is my message for people for this morning, and I thank you. You've been very, very attentive audience. Thank you.